Close your eyes and step back into the world of the Middle Ages. The year is 1347. Outside, the cobbled streets are wet from a late-night rain, and the smell of hearth smoke lingers in the air. Inside a dimly lit chamber, a straw-stuffed mattress creaks beneath rough linen sheets, and a single beeswax candle flickers against the stone wall. Tonight is not just another night. It is a wedding night, and in this world, intimacy carries expectations, rules, and sometimes even witnesses. When we imagine medieval love, we often picture knights and ladies, troubadours singing under moonlit balconies, and secret kisses stolen in castle gardens. But the truth is far more complicated. Intimacy in this time was shaped by law, faith, superstition, and yes, by very real, very human practices that might surprise you. Before we pull back the covers of history, let me ask you, if you were there, bound by duty and watched by family, would you obey the rules of the church, or would you dare to follow your heart? Think about that as we uncover the hidden truths of how medieval couples really practiced intimacy. And while you're here, you re-watching Whispers of History, where we reveal the untold secrets the past tried to keep hidden. Make sure to subscribe, because trust me, you don't want to miss the next story waiting in the shadows. Now, let's return to our chamber. The medieval wedding night was often more public than private. In noble households, after the feasting was done, the couple would be paraded to their bed by friends and family, sometimes even stripped down to their linens, with laughter and bawdy songs filling the hall. It wasn't unusual for witnesses to remain until the couple lay down together, ensuring the union was valid. Imagine the pressure of your most intimate moment turned into a performance. For some, it was a game. For others, sheer humiliation. Once the door closed, however, the real complexity began. The church dictated strict rules for marital intimacy. No passion for pleasure's sake, only for procreation. Certain positions were considered sinful. The missionary position was tolerated, but anything else could earn you a stern rebuke in confession. Couples were warned not to embrace on Sundays, feast days, or during Lent. According to some medieval calendars, nearly a third of the year was off-limits. Desire, in other words, was placed on a timetable. But people are people, and behind closed doors, couples bent the rules. We know this because confession manuals from the time, written for priests, detail all the forbidden acts they were expected to ask about. Some priests recorded that couples admitted to using different positions for comfort or pleasure. Despite the church's warnings, others confessed to seeking closeness on days they weren't supposed to. This tells us something powerful. Intimacy in the Middle Ages was not lifeless or mechanical. It was tender, playful, inventive, even rebellious. And here's a surprising truth. While we imagine medieval couples as prudish, historical records suggest they experimented more than we think. In some regions, oral intimacy was whispered about, condemned by priests, but practiced nonetheless. In others, couples used herbal salves and oils believed to heighten passion. These details survive only because they were sins recorded by moralists. But in reality, they show how ordinary couples searched for ways to connect beyond what was officially allowed. Superstition also shaped the bedroom. Fertility was everything, especially for nobles who needed heirs. Couples sometimes drank spiced wine mixed with herbs like ginger and saffron, believing it increased desire. Some slept with amulets under their pillows or war charms stitched into their clothing to ensure conception. Others consulted astrologers to determine the best nights for closeness, waiting until the stars promised good fortune. For peasants, the rituals were simpler: a sprig of basil by the bed, or bread and salt shared before lying down. But the belief in symbols was the same. Yet intimacy was not always driven by duty alone. There are rare but moving glimpses of genuine affection. A husband writing to his wife while away at war, confessing how much he missed her warmth. a wife managing the household while her husband traveled, hiding small love notes in his clothing chest. These fragments remind us that medieval love, though bound by law, was also deeply human. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Not all intimacy was consensual, and not all marriages were kind. For noble women especially, the bed was often a place of obligation rather than choice. A young bride, barely a teenager, might be forced into marriage with an older man to secure land or alliances. In such cases, intimacy was duty at best, trauma at worst. Records of annulments and court cases reveal the painful realities behind the gilded illusions of romance. Still, even in these harsh realities, couples found ways to shape their own stories. Humor, affection, and secrecy thrived. Imagine a noblewoman slipping a knowing glance at her husband across the hall, or a peasant couple laughing quietly as they shared a stolen moment in the fields. These tiny rebellions against rigidity reveal that intimacy was not only about survival or sin, it was also about joy. And so we arrive at the first great paradox of medieval intimacy. It was both heavily policed and quietly free. The church thundered from pulpits about sin and shame, yet behind shuttered windows, couples experimented, laughed, whispered, and lived in ways that defied the rules. But what happened when desire could not be contained within marriage? When couples sought intimacy outside the bonds of duty, the answer, as you'll soon discover, is filled with danger, scandal, and secrets that could destroy lives. Picture a grand medieval court, tapestries of saints and battles hanging on the walls, the air thick with incense and candle smoke. At the center of this world sits a noblewoman, married not for love but for alliance. Her husband is away, fighting in the king's service, and into the hall strides a young knight whose songs have already whispered her name. He glances once, too long, and she looks away. But in that single moment, a story is born. Forbidden love was one of the greatest dangers of medieval intimacy. Marriage was duty. Passion outside it was sin. And yet, in castle gardens, at feasts, and even during pilgrimages, secret romances blossomed. Courtly love, celebrated in the songs of troubadours, painted a picture of knights pledging loyalty to ladies who were often already married. These tales, filled with longing and stolen glances, both entertained and scandalized. The church condemned them, but the songs spread like wildfire. Why? Because they reflected a truth people recognized. Desire does not always obey the rules. But secret passion came at a high price. Noble women who strayed faced ruin. Some were banished to convents, their reputations destroyed. Others met harsher fates. Chronicles tell of women executed when their affairs became known. Men risked disgrace, exile, or worse if they dishonored powerful families. And yet, the stories of such scandals fill medieval records, proving how common temptation truly was. Among peasants, the risks were different, but no less real. A man and woman found together outside of marriage might be dragged before the church courts. Their punishment: public confession, humiliation, or sometimes harsh fines. Imagine standing barefoot in front of your village, forced to admit what you had done, while neighbors whispered and smirked. And yet, couples still took the risk, carving out stolen moments in barns, fields, or riversides. Desire made them daring, even when discovery meant shame. So what did these forbidden meetings actually look like? Historians, drawing from confession manuals and court testimonies, reveal surprising details. Couples sometimes met under the pretense of going to confession or to fetch water. They exchanged coded words or left tokens in secret places. And when passion overpowered caution, they defied the church's rules outright. The practices themselves varied, but one thing is clear: medieval couples were far more inventive than the official records would have us believe. Positions beyond the acceptable missionary were indeed used, so much so that priests wrote about them constantly, trying in vain to stamp them out. Some lovers experimented with oral intimacy, labeled a grave sin but still practiced. Herbal remedies, salves, and even aphrodisiac foods like honey, garlic, and spiced wine were shared in private, believed to enhance passion. These confessions, preserved in dusty manuscripts, accidentally revealed the very truths the church wanted hidden. But secrecy was never guaranteed. A careless glance, a servant's loose tongue, a suspicious husband. Discovery could come suddenly, and the consequences were merciless. Adultery was considered not just a personal failing, but a threat to the entire social order. If a noble heir was born of questionable parentage, entire dynasties could collapse. The stakes, therefore, were not just emotional, but political. Still, some stories show that passion was stronger than fear. The legendary romance of Abelard and Heloise, though tragic, proved unforgettable. Their letters, filled with tenderness and longing, survive to this day, echoing across centuries. They remind us that medieval intimacy was not all obedience. It was also rebellion, sometimes paid for dearly, but remembered forever. Even for married couples, secrecy played a role. Privacy was rare in medieval households, especially among peasants who often shared one-room cottages with children, parents, and even livestock. Couples seeking a moment alone had to be creative, slipping away during festivals, meeting by the fields at dusk, or waiting until the household was asleep. Imagine the thrill of intimacy in a world where privacy was almost impossible, where every touch carried the risk of discovery. And this brings us to another paradox. The very restrictions of medieval society may have heightened passion itself. When desire was forbidden, it became more intense. A stolen kiss in a chapel corner, a hand brushing against another in a crowded hall. Such moments carried a weight far greater than routine displays of affection today. The risk gave intimacy a dangerous sweetness, a thrill that fueled poetry, songs, and rumors alike. But let's not forget, not all intimacy outside marriage was born of romance. Some was exploitation, born of unequal power. Lords often claimed rights over servants or peasants, using authority to blur the line between affection and coercion. These darker realities remind us that intimacy in the Middle Ages could be dangerous not just to reputation, but to safety itself. And yet, even amid this harshness, genuine love still managed to survive, whispered in secret words and hidden in quiet gestures. So we are left with another question. If passion found a way despite danger, what of marriages themselves? Were they truly as cold and duty-bound as we imagine, or did couples manage to discover warmth and companionship within the bonds of wedlock? The answer may surprise you, because behind the formalities of contracts and alliances, there are countless stories of laughter, affection, and yes, real intimacy between husband and wife. And that's where we'll go next. But before we continue, take a breath and reflect. If you lived in a world where desire could cost you everything, would you still take the risk? Let me know in the comments. I love reading your thoughts. And remember, you're watching Whispers of History. If you're enjoying this journey, subscribe now, because the secrets of the past are only beginning to unfold. Now, step back into the chamber, away from the scandal of secret affairs, and consider the heart of medieval life, marriage itself. For while stories of forbidden passion capture our imagination, most men and women lived within the bonds of wedlock. And though many of these marriages were arranged, often for duty or survival, they were not always as cold or loveless as we might think. Picture a peasant couple in a thatched cottage. The fire sputters in the hearth, the smell of onions and bread fills the air, and children sleep nearby under wool blankets. Privacy is scarce, yet in the middle of this noisy, crowded life, two people lean toward one another, finding comfort in a stolen touch or a whispered word. Their intimacy is not grand, but it is steady, born of years of labor shared and burdens carried together. For them, love is survival, and survival is love. Among nobles, the expectations were different. Marriage meant alliances, property and heirs. A young bride might arrive at her husband's castle knowing little of him. Her wedding day, the first time she had ever spoken to him. Yet records show that affection often grew over time. Couples who started as strangers sometimes built bonds of trust, humor, and even tenderness. Think of the countless dinners, long winters, and daily decisions they shared. Through repetition, partnership became companionship. And yes, intimacy played a role in this. While the church preached that marital union should be purely for procreation, many couples quietly sought comfort and pleasure as well. Confession manuals again reveal this reality. Priests lamented that couples did not always keep to the approved ways. Yet their very complaints prove that husbands and wives explored beyond the limits. Some used different positions for comfort. Others experimented with touch and foreplay. Though condemned, these practices were clearly common. Superstition and ritual shaped marriage beds, too. A couple eager for children might sleep with charms tucked beneath the mattress. A sprig of rosemary, a carved token, or even bones believed to carry fertility. Some believed that conception was more likely during certain moon phases or when certain foods were eaten. Spiced wine, garlic, basil, and honey were all thought to stir desire. And while priests frowned at such pagan practices, they persisted, whispered from one generation to the next. There was also laughter in these chambers. Humor is rarely recorded in chronicles, but manuscripts and folk tales leave hints. Wives teased husbands for snoring. Husbands joked about the cost of dowries. Couples shared laughter at feasts, in games, or even in bed, where intimacy sometimes carried more playfulness than piety. For every stern sermon against desire, there were countless quiet moments of giggles and warmth that no chronicler thought worth writing down, yet they were surely there. Love letters, though rare, give us a clearer window. One French husband wrote to his wife, "I miss not only your counsel, but your embrace." Another confessed he longed for the touch of her hand, more than he longed for riches. These voices, fragile on parchment, cut across centuries to remind us that medieval marriages were not always devoid of passion. Some contained deep affection, expressed cautiously in ink, hidden under wax seals. But intimacy was not always joyful. Childbirth was dangerous, and wives often carried fear into the marriage bed. Many women lost children or their own lives during labor. Husbands grieved deeply, as records of memorial prayers show, yet the cycle of duty continued. Infertility, too, was a heavy burden, and almost always the blame fell on women. Some faced gossip, humiliation, or even annulment. Others, however, were defended by their husbands, who refused to set them aside. In those rare cases, intimacy proved stronger than expectation. For peasants, hardship and love were entwined. In famine years, a husband giving his portion of bread to his wife was as intimate as any embrace. In winter, sharing warmth under a single blanket became an act of closeness. These gestures may seem small, but they carried the weight of survival. Love was not always spoken, but it was lived, through sacrifice and care. The marriage bed itself reflected intimacy and hierarchy. In noble homes, great carved beds with curtains offered rare privacy. For peasants, a straw mattress might be shared with children or parents. Yet even in the simplest of homes, couples created rituals of intimacy, waiting until the household slept, or rising before dawn to find a moment alone. Secrecy was not only for affairs. Even married couples often guarded their private lives from the watchful eyes of family and neighbors. And so we see another paradox. Marriage in the Middle Ages was both a contract and a companionship, both duty and devotion. Couples were expected to follow the strict laws of faith and society, yet they found ways to bend them, to turn duty into affection and affection into joy. But here's a question. How long could such delicate balances last? What happened when hardship struck? When famine, plague, or grief tested these bonds? Did intimacy survive when the world itself seemed to fall apart? The answer, as history reveals, is both heartbreaking and inspiring. Couples faced unimaginable trials, yet through them, intimacy did not vanish. In fact, it often grew stronger, reshaped by suffering into something deeper, more enduring. And that's where we'll go next. But before we move forward, take a moment. Can you imagine living in a home where privacy barely existed, where every embrace had to be stolen, whispered, or hidden? Would love survive, or would it wither under such weight? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget, you're watching Whispers of History. Subscribe if you haven't yet, because in the next chapter, we'll see how love survived not just rules, but the hardest trials of medieval life. Hardship was the constant companion of the medieval world, and it tested intimacy in ways both cruel and unexpected. Plagues, famine, and war loomed over every household, noble or peasant. And yet, in these trials, the bonds between couples were revealed with striking clarity. Some fractured under the strain. Others deepened into something so enduring that even history's harshest storms could not sweep it away. Imagine the scene during the Black Death of the 14th century. Streets emptied, church bells tolled without ceasing, and fear gnawed at every door. For couples who survived, the world was stripped of certainty. Every embrace, every touch became an act of defiance against death. Some married quickly, rushing to find comfort in one another before the sickness struck. Others clung to their spouses, intimacy transformed from duty into desperate reassurance. Records tell of couples who sought closeness even in sickness, believing that if they were to perish, they would perish together. Famine carried its own burdens. A poor harvest meant empty granaries, and couples were forced to ration every crumb. In these years, intimacy was not measured by passion, but by sacrifice. A husband who gave his portion of bread to his wife, a wife who walked miles to barter for food. These were acts of devotion as powerful as any kiss. When survival itself was uncertain, love became an unspoken pact. I will endure this with you. Among nobles, hardship looked different, but pressed just as hard. A countess who lost child after child in infancy might be blamed for her failure. Whispers spread in halls, questioning her fertility. Some women were set aside or forced into convents. Yet there are stories tucked into wills and letters of husbands who remained steadfast, refusing to cast their wives away despite pressure from family and church. Such loyalty, rare but real, transformed duty into something closer to modern love. Childbirth itself was one of the greatest trials couples faced. For women, it was perilous. For men, it was agonizing to wait helplessly outside the chamber, listening to cries within. Many mothers did not survive. Those who did carried both relief and fear into the next pregnancy. Husbands often commissioned prayers or pilgrimages for their wives' safety, and when loss struck, grief was profound. Lullabies written by grieving mothers, prayers preserved by fathers. These fragments show intimacy woven into sorrow. To mourn together was itself an act of closeness, and illness never came alone. A fever could sweep through a household, leaving one spouse weak, the other tending to them with herbs, charms, or whispered prayers. In these dimly lit chambers, intimacy was measured by care. A hand cooling a burning brow, a voice steadying the night. Many couples discovered that love's truest form was not in passion but in patience. Even in the midst of disaster, superstition offered guidance. Couples burned herbs to ward off plague, wore amulets for health, or slept with protective charms near their beds. Some sought intimacy during dangerous times, believing it could bring balance or healing, while others abstained in fear of angering God. The tension between faith, fear, and desire was constant, and yet humanity always found ways to keep affection alive. Privacy remained scarce. Peasants, packed into one-room cottages with children and livestock, often found their intimacy interrupted by the rhythms of daily life. But hardship created moments of secrecy, too. A couple rising early, before the household stirred, or staying awake by the embers after others had gone to sleep, could carve out small sanctuaries of closeness. In noble households, servants, relatives, and attendants were always present, so even lords and ladies learned to treasure fleeting moments behind drawn bed curtains. And then there was war. Husbands marched away, sometimes for years, leaving wives to manage estates or farms. Letters sent from distant battlefields often spoke not only of duty but of longing. Longing for touch, for the warmth of shared beds, for the comfort of ordinary days. Some men never returned, their wives left widowed young, their intimacy cut short by swords and politics. Others came home scarred, their marriages reshaped by trauma but also strengthened by reunion. In every trial, intimacy adapted. It might be expressed in sacrifice, in prayer, in care, or in shared grief. The medieval world demanded resilience, and love provided it. Perhaps that is the most surprising truth of all. Intimacy in the Middle Ages was not just about passion or procreation. It was about survival. And survival, in turn, often deepened intimacy in ways the church could neither dictate nor control. Yet, hardship also created cracks. Under the strain of famine or plague, some marriages broke. Blame fell heavily on women, whether for infertility, illness, or misfortune. Court records reveal separations, accusations, and disputes brought before priests. Love could falter, and intimacy could wither. These stories remind us that medieval marriages were not fairy tales. They were as fragile and complex as any today. Still, for every broken bond, there are countless untold stories of couples who endured together, who held hands against the tide of history. Their names may be forgotten, their stories never written, but their love was no less real. So, here lies the question. What legacy did these struggles leave behind? How did intimacy in the Middle Ages, with its mixture of duty, passion, secrecy, and resilience, shape the way we understand love even today? The answers lie not only in dusty chronicles, but in the quiet lessons whispered from the past. Lessons that suggest intimacy is not fragile, but fiercely enduring. And in the next part of this journey, we'll uncover just that. How medieval intimacy, with all its contradictions, planted seeds that still shape how we love, laugh, and reach for one another centuries later. But before we continue, take a moment. If you lived in a world where plague, famine, and war were never far away, do you think intimacy would weaken, or would it burn brighter in defiance of it all? Let me know in the comments. And remember, this is Whispers of History, where the secrets of the past find their voice again. Subscribe now, because what comes next might surprise you. Not every medieval story of intimacy was marked by hardship or secrecy. In fact, there was another side to love in the Middle Ages, one often overlooked. The laughter, the playfulness, the small rituals that transformed marriage from a cold contract into a shared life. Because intimacy was not always about rules, or survival, or even passion. Sometimes, it was about joy. Imagine a noble hall during a winter feast. The fire roars in the great hearth, minstrels strum their lutes, and jesters juggle before a crowd of lords and ladies. In the corner, a husband leans toward his wife with a private joke, and she hides her laughter behind her sleeve. Or picture a village fair in summer. Couples dance together to the sound of drums and pipes, their steps clumsy but cheerful, their glances full of warmth. Even in a world filled with danger and duty, love found space to be light-hearted. This playfulness extended into the private world of intimacy. Confession manuals might have condemned desire for pleasure's sake, but evidence shows that couples often treated intimacy not just as a duty but as something enjoyable. Medieval folk medicine even recommended foods thought to heighten desire: spiced wine, roasted garlic, honey, or almonds. Some couples experimented with herbs like basil or fennel, said to warm the body and soften the heart. These rituals, though couched in superstition, reveal a pursuit of not only fertility but affection. And yes, couples bent the rules in the bedroom, often with a wink and a laugh. Though priests scolded against improper positions, records show that people tried them anyway. Some scholars argue that even humor was part of intimacy, with partners teasing one another or joking about desire. In a world where so much was forbidden, laughter itself became a quiet act of rebellion. Superstition also added a curious flavor to love. A woman might slip a charm into her husband's clothing to keep him faithful, or a man might carve initials into wood for luck in love. In some regions, couples wore matching tokens, rings, embroidered cloths, or even herbs tied in pouches, as symbols of affection. These small gestures, while rooted in folklore, carried emotional weight. They were reminders that intimacy was not just physical, but symbolic, woven into the rituals of daily life. Folk songs and stories also give us clues. Many medieval ballads were playful, even cheeky, celebrating love with double meanings. A song sung at a fair might sound innocent, but carry hidden references everyone understood. These performances gave couples a safe way to express affection in public without breaking rules. Imagine laughing along with a tune that hinted at desire while pretending, with a knowing smile, that it was only about flowers or birds. Companionship was another quiet form of intimacy. While grand romances grab attention, most couples lived ordinary lives together, working in fields, managing households, raising children. In those routines, affection grew. A wife sharpening her husband's blade, a husband repairing his wife's spinning wheel. These acts of care, though mundane, built bonds of trust. It was intimacy lived, not in passion but in partnership, and humor extended beyond the bedchamber. Manuscripts of the Middle Ages often contain marginal drawings, strange little doodles of animals, jesters, or even bawdy scenes. These sketches suggest that medieval people had a playful side, even when copying holy texts. It's not far-fetched to imagine that this same humor carried into their personal lives. After all, laughter has always been part of love. Letters give us more direct glimpses. A French husband once wrote to his wife, joking about the dullness of camp life without her company. Another teased about sending her gifts, but warned she might owe him a kiss or two. In return, such playful banter shows that intimacy was not always stern or solemn. It could be light-hearted, flirty, and fun. Even rituals of faith contained moments of affection. Couples prayed together, lit candles for one another's health, or made pilgrimages side by side. Though these acts were outwardly religious, they also deepened intimacy. Walking miles together, sharing hardship on the road, or kneeling shoulder to shoulder in a chapel. These experiences built bonds as much as laughter or desire. But here lies another paradox. Intimacy in the Middle Ages existed on a knife's edge. Too much public affection could invite gossip, yet too little could be seen as coldness. Couples had to navigate carefully, showing just enough closeness to reassure family and neighbors, while guarding their most tender moments for privacy. In this balance, intimacy became a dance, one that combined affection, secrecy, ritual, and joy. It's easy to imagine the Middle Ages as dark and repressive, but the truth is more nuanced. Behind the sermons and prohibitions, couples found ways to nurture love. They whispered jokes, exchanged tokens, shared bread and wine, and stole glances across crowded halls. They lived within rules, but created space for tenderness, and in that space, intimacy thrived. So, the question remains, was this playfulness merely a rebellion against restriction? Or was it proof that love, in any age, always finds a way to laugh, to smile, and to endure? The answer, perhaps, is both. And in the next part of our journey, we step even deeper into the paradox, into the shadows, where intimacy became both a sanctuary and a danger, where scandal and secrecy threatened everything couples built together. But before we continue, tell me this. If you lived in a world where every gesture might be judged, Would you still risk laughter, playfulness, even passion? Or would you hide your heart? Share your thoughts below. I always love hearing them. And remember, you're watching Whispers of History. Subscribe now, because the past still has secrets to whisper, and the next one may be the most surprising yet. For all its laughter, playfulness, and quiet tenderness, intimacy in the Middle Ages also carried shadows. It was a source of joy, yes, but it could also be a weapon, a tool of power, and at times, a danger that cost people their reputations, their families, or even their lives. Behind the walls of castles and within the narrow lanes of villages, intimacy could become entangled with politics, coercion, and scandal. Consider the imbalance of power between lord and servant. In many noble households, young women worked as maids, cooks, or laundresses. Their proximity to the ruling family often placed them in vulnerable positions. A lord could demand attention, blurring the line between desire and coercion. Sometimes these encounters were hidden beneath the guise of consent, but the reality was often exploitation. For the women, the risks were devastating. Pregnancies outside marriage, public shame, or dismissal without protection. Chronicles rarely dwell on these stories, but scattered court records and confessions tell us enough to know they were far from rare. In some regions, the so-called rite of the first night, the idea that a lord could claim a bride on her wedding night, was whispered about. Historians debate whether this was ever truly practiced, or if it was mostly rumor spread to demonize feudal lords. But whether myth or reality, the fact that such a rumor existed tells us how deeply people feared the misuse of power in the most intimate of spaces. Even among nobles, scandal was never far away. Kings and queens themselves were not immune. In England, France, and beyond, rumors swirled around royal marriages, accusations of affairs, illegitimate children, and betrayals that shook dynasties. These scandals were not mere gossip. They threatened entire kingdoms. A queen accused of unfaithfulness could see her children declared illegitimate, stripping them of their right to rule. A king caught in public scandal risked rebellion or loss of loyalty among his nobles. The stakes of intimacy at this level were nothing less than political survival. But scandal was not confined to courts. In villages, too, intimacy could ignite drama. A wife accused of adultery might be dragged before church courts, her shame made public. Sometimes her husband forgave her, other times he cast her out. Men, too, faced punishment, though often less severe. Double standards were deeply ingrained, leaving women to bear the heavier cost of reputation. Gossip could spread like wildfire, turning a private mistake into a lifetime of humiliation. And yet, despite the dangers, intimacy continued to defy restrictions. Lovers found ways to meet in secret, risking everything for fleeting moments of connection. We know this because their mistakes are preserved in court records. Cases of couples caught in barns, in forests, or even in churches. The punishments varied: fines, public penance, even imprisonment. But the fact remains that desire pushed people to take chances, even when the consequences were dire. Superstition sometimes offered dangerous solutions. Herbal mixtures were used not only to encourage fertility, but also to prevent it. Some women turned to potions and charms to avoid unwanted pregnancies. Though the risks were high, ineffective remedies could lead to exposure, while stronger concoctions could harm the body. These practices reveal a hidden side of medieval intimacy, the struggle of women to control their own lives in a world where their choices were often taken from them. But intimacy was not only personal, it was deeply tied to honor. A nobleman's reputation depended not only on his military strength, but also on the perceived chastity of his wife. Protecting a woman's virtue was, in many ways, protecting the family's status. This pressure weighed heavily on noble women, who lived under constant watch. A single rumor could undo years of respectability. For peasants, honor worked differently but was no less important. A A family standing in the village could rise or fall based on gossip about its daughters. And so intimacy became a performance as much as a reality. Couples had to navigate carefully, showing the right amount of closeness in public while concealing their private struggles. Too little affection might invite whispers of coldness or infertility. Too much could be seen as impropriety. It was a delicate balance, and one misstep could tip the scales toward scandal. Yet, even in these darker corners, humanity shines through. Consider the letters of Heloise and Abelard, still preserved today. Their affair, forbidden and tragic, ended in punishment. Abelard mutilated, Heloise confined to a convent. Yet their letters overflow with affection, longing, and intellectual intimacy that defied their fate. Their story is a reminder that even when intimacy was punished, it left a mark too powerful to erase. So what does all this tell us? That intimacy in the Middle Ages was not simply personal. It was political, social, and dangerous. It could unite families or tear them apart, elevate reputations or destroy them. It was a force that could be tender, playful, and life-affirming, but also perilous when caught in the gears of power. And this leads us to one final question. If intimacy in the medieval world was so fraught with rules, dangers, and consequences, why did people still pursue it with such determination? Why risk scandal, punishment, or worse for something so dangerous? The answer, perhaps, is the same now as it was then. Because intimacy is not just about survival or duty or even pleasure. It is about being human, about connection, vulnerability, and longing for something more than what the world allows. And in our final part, we will bring everything together to uncover what medieval intimacy truly reveals about love itself, and why these whispers from the past still matter today. But before we close this chapter, I'll ask you, if you were a noblewoman, your every move watched, your reputation hanging by a thread, would you risk it all for a secret love? Or would you bow to duty, guarding your life but sacrificing your heart? Share your thoughts in the comments. I always enjoy reading them. And remember, you're watching Whispers of History. Subscribe now, because the conclusion to this story may just change the way you see the Middle Ages forever. We've walked together through shadowed chambers, crowded feasts, secret gardens, and quiet cottages. We've seen intimacy in the Middle Ages from every angle. From the laughter of married couples who found comfort in one another, to the dangerous thrill of forbidden affairs, to the darker corners where power turned closeness into coercion. And as our journey comes to an end, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Intimacy then, as now, was never simple. It was a paradox, always suspended between law and longing, faith and desire, duty and rebellion. The church thundered about sin, prescribing calendars and positions, but couples still whispered and touched when they weren't supposed to. Nobles married for alliances, but sometimes discovered affection within those very bonds. Peasants shared straw beds with their children nearby, yet still carved out moments of laughter and tenderness. And when rules were too heavy, when secrecy became necessary, love found its own paths. Stolen glances, coded words, charms slipped under pillows. These became the language of intimacy. Sometimes it was joyful, sometimes tragic, but always deeply human. The real practices of medieval couples, too, reveal this complexity. Missionary was the approved position, but others were used, despite clerical warnings. Herbal salves and oils were rubbed into the skin. Spiced wine and honey were shared to stir desire, and even oral intimacy, fiercely condemned, was whispered about in confessionals. The fact that priests wrote about these things at all proves how widespread they were. Intimacy, in other words, was not rigid. It was inventive, experimental, and very much alive. But beyond the physical, intimacy was also emotional and symbolic. It was in the humor that filled feasts, the prayers whispered side by side, the love letters exchanged between battlefields and castles. It was in sacrifice during famine, in comfort during plague, in the steady rhythm of shared survival. Love was not always passionate, but it was enduring. So what do we learn from all of this? That intimacy is not fragile, but resilient. It adapts to rules, bends under hardship, and even flourishes in secrecy. Whether in castles or cottages, people have always longed for connection, to be seen, to be touched, to be loved. Perhaps the greatest surprise is how familiar it all feels. We may not share straw mattresses or fear the watchful eye of priests, but the emotions are the same. The thrill of forbidden love, the comfort of a partner's hand in hardship, the laughter of an inside joke, the grief of shared loss. These are not medieval, they are human, timeless, universal. And this is why the whispers of history matter. They remind us that we are not so different from those who lived centuries ago. Their world was shaped by superstition, duty, and fear, but their hearts beat with the same rhythms as ours. They sought closeness, they broke rules, they carried secrets, they cherished affection. So the next time you picture the Middle Ages, don't only see stern priests and stone castles. See the stolen glances, the playful laughter, the candles flickering in dark rooms. See the humanity that flourished even in the harshest of times. Because in the end, intimacy is the thread that ties us all together across centuries and continents. Now, I'll leave you with one final thought. If you had lived in the medieval world, bound by rules, watched by neighbors, judged by priests, what kind of lover would you have been? Would you have followed every rule faithfully, or would you have risked secrecy for passion? Would you have chosen duty, or dared to chase love? Tell me in the comments. I love reading your reflections, and your insights always add new light to these journeys through the past. And remember, you've been watching Whispers of History, where the past speaks softly, if you only know how to listen. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and join me again. Because the Middle Ages still hold countless secrets, and together we'll uncover them, one whisper at a time. For now, close your eyes. Let the flicker of the candle fade, let the whispers of the medieval chamber dissolve into night, and drift into rest knowing this. Intimacy, fragile yet unbreakable, has always been at the heart of the human story.